Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of Philosophy 307, Philosophy of Law. This week, we're going to talk about Native Americans' property rights in the law, particularly property law and property rights. Um, as you can see, this is for those watching, not listening, this is a very cool picture of um, a Native American tribe back in the day in Deadwood, South Dakota. Hey, guys. All right, so last week we talked about the institution of property as a means of dealing with what we call the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is a tragedy that takes place when you have commonly shared resources and a group where individual members and parts of the group lack the incentive to preserve resources. So one of the classic examples is to overfish the oceans. Um, Corporations and companies that do that in international waters are instituting or bringing about a tragedy of the commons being the international waters of the ocean, and the tragedy being the lack of fish. So, like we talked about last week, this is why property rights and the governments and constitutions and legal documents that back them up are essential, at least essential tools, if not perfect solutions, to addressing tragedies of the commons, of the overuse of resources. So just to refresh, the Constitution protects property rights through the Fifth and 14th Amendments, Due Process Clause, and the Fifth Amendment's Takings Clause. This is the idea that nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This clause in particular is designed to prevent tragedies of the commons. If you could take private property for public use whenever the government felt like it, then it could just do that. If there's a check on that power, meaning something the government has to do before they can take property, it's going to impose a cost on violating property rights. So, for the classic case in the 1800s after the Civil War, was that the government would buy land or try and take it um, to put rail on it to connect the East and West United States. Um, and ironically, a lot of that involved taking without just compensation. But the idea is that the government will do, and the government and other groups will take resources and overuse the resources insofar as doing so is easy. So what we need to do is find ways of incentivizing people to not overuse resources, and property rights and the institution of property rights is one way of doing that. That's so, and the Constitution is part of that puzzle, or part of that set of tools we use to address tragedies of the commons. So there's basically two ways the government can take your property, as we talked about last week, by outright condemning the property and taking it. So um, that would be where you could condemn the property. Maybe it's unusable for human consumption or human occupation, in other words, or in some way or shape, or maybe you haven't paid the taxes. And whatever it is, so the government condemns the property and then takes the title, and then in the right under the right conditions or in a subset of those conditions will pay the owner. The other one is through regulatory taking, and this is where the title stays with the owner, and the government just regulates the owner's ability to use property. So one of the reasons that property rights are and the institution of property is a solution to the tragedy of the commons is because it gives people the incentive to treat their property better, to preserve their resources, sort of like you treat uh, an owned car better than a rental car, typically. And it also provides the mechanism to prevent overuse by others, because property rights entail exclusion. You can exclude others from your using your property. That's what property rights are. You both have the incentive to preserve resources for the future, more so than you would if it was a commons, and you have a mechanism to prevent overuse by others because you have property rights. So, so-called the first clause of the titles. So basically, what you want the government to prevent takings by others and to limit its own takings, because otherwise it undercuts property rights, and that just undercuts that just prevents and that just creates all kinds of tragedies of the commons. So you would have overuse everywhere. People wouldn't treat things very well. So we would have even worse problems with our environment. And we went over all kinds of environmental, health, and resource issues involving tragedy of the commons, everything from overusing antibiotics to overgrazing land, traffic congestion, and even climate change. Um, so there's a sense in which, and I also mentioned last week that um, when you grant people property rights, there's a sense in which you're giving them a means of accountability. It's hard to keep a bunch of people accountable for things that happen in a commons because it's not clear who did what, and everybody has access to it. It's sort of like a public space. Who is responsible for goes in the public space? It's a little less clear when it's a public space and public use, but it's not so much when people own it. So if someone owns a piece of property and they've done a terrible job environmentally, you can fine them. The government can do all kinds of things to hold them uh, accountable. But you want people solving the tragedy of the commons, and one way to do that is constitutions with property rights. And if the government or other people take things too frequently, it undercuts the stability and prosperity of a liberal democracy. So that can be an issue, big time. So that's why we want the government to compensate. That's why we want property rights. Such takings, whether they're regulatory takings or condemn like title takings, it doesn't really matter. And it cuts the stability and prosperity of a liberal democracy. So property rights matter, is what I'm trying to get at. And this is why we have it in the Constitution. The property rights are in the Constitution, and they matter for things like solving tragedy of the commons and environment. They're not the only tools like we talked about last week, but they matter. But if property matters so much and ownership matters so much, then it does seem to pose a question, particularly in the United States, given our history. Um, should we give Native Americans their land back? This is an important question, and it's especially pertinent in a state like Arizona. It would be also be pertinent in places like Oklahoma and Colorado, places where we have like a large Native American presence, both presently and historically. Um, so if our society benefits from property rights, and if giving American citizens property rights helps prevent tragedies of the commons, then maybe the property rights and sovereignty would benefit Native Americans. And for those who are watching and not just listening, in the background you can see a nice, at least a partial map of the continental United States. Oops, designated with the designation of where these various tribes were located. So you can see all kinds of, so I think it's pretty cool. You can see where all these different tribes were located. Or many of them. Hundreds, not thousands. And I mean, this map isn't going to do historical justice, but it gives you a sense of what we're talking about. So what benefits would occur to Native American tribes, and why should they want their land back? Well, they can regain ownership. Um, regain ownership of land that wasn't sold or voluntarily given up. Some land was sold. Some Native Americans sold their land. This is more common than people realize. Sometimes it was voluntarily given up. It's not just like the story of America and Native Americans is not just one of conquest. So it feels like either people will paint it as one of complete conquest. There was no choices. Native Americans just had their land stolen. And there's some truth to that, but it's not completely right. And then others just think, no, there wasn't a lot of genocide or stealing going on. It was mostly voluntary transfers, and that's just not true either. But there is land they didn't very necessarily sell or voluntarily give up. It was taken from them. Um, it would better ensure their survival of Native American culture, insofar as cultures are valuable, especially marginal cultures, minority cultures. There's something to that. Um, it's to challenge and revise misunderstanding of Native American culture and the dominant culture. Most Americans don't really have a good idea, good sense of Native American tribes and the diversity of them. The Comanches and the Crow, for example, were very, very different tribes. And then, to address the tragedy of the commons and prosperity, explored in the last unit. But it's one where if Native Americans are going to have tragedy of the commons too, and there's going to be cases where Native Americans, insofar as they're larger societies or larger tribes, are going to need something like property rights. Now, whether or not they use the property rights as a way to deal with tragedy of the commons or other mechanisms, because last week we talked, there's other ways of doing this, is really not the point. The point is it's a tool they could use to help them with this issue. It would address the memory misunderstanding of American culture. It would help the survival of their culture, and it would rectify past injustices, at least some of the kind. So those are the reasons. Um, So let's start with our basic facts. And Burke Hendricks, the author of our paper, does a really good job laying them out. Quote, the basic facts here are obvious. Native peoples occupied the land first. Whenever land was taken without treaties or in violation of treaties or without due sale, it seems reasonable to believe that natives are still rightful owners and that we, meaning mainstream Americans in the United States, should give that land back. Now, end quote. Now, keep in mind here that Hendricks, our author, is not simply saying, irrespective of any other considerations, we should just hand land back over. Um, it's to say that we should just hand land back over is to ignore a lot of nuances. But I do think what Hendricks is getting here is why some people find land acknowledgments to be shallow. Just this is where people will often start by saying, "I want to acknowledge that we're standing on the traditional lands of the," and then they'll usually list the tribes, and then we pay homage to the tribe, blah blah blah. The ironic part about a land acknowledgement is it doesn't really do much for the tribe. Uh, it may do some consciousness raising, but I think Hendricks' point, and a lot of other people writing in this space would just say land acknowledgements are a joke, morally speaking, because they neither give the land back. They just basically make a bunch of people feel guilty about stuff that happened in the past. And especially insofar as Native American tribes are still around, they might find the land acknowledgements a little vapid. This would be the equivalent of me going to someone's house where I stole their car, knocking on their door, announcing that I stole their car. Like, they open the door, hey, how's it going? Hi, my name's Jimmy. I stole your car. I just wanted to acknowledge that and let you know that I'm taking very, very good care of it. Of course, the person may ask, can I have it back? Well, no, I reply, but I'm acknowledging that I took it. So, you know, that's a silly example, obviously, and it's meant to illustrate that land acknowledgements in and of themselves don't do much. So the basic facts here are that Native Americans occupied the land first. What seems to be left out is that, okay, so there's complications. Um, for those watching, this is the picture and the slide is of the painter's depiction of the Trail of Tears, relocating the Cherokee to the Oklahoma plains. So there's some complications here, right, with Native American ownership and giving back the land. And Hendricks acknowledges that. Some of them include, quote, number one, some native tribes that were displaced have died off. So whether it was because the members of the tribe just didn't have children, whether it was because the ones that didn't have children stayed, the ones that did left, a lot of Native Americans have entered sort of more general populations. Um, so as such, as tribes, they may cease to exist even if the members still exist. So some tribes have just ceased to exist, died off, or two, a piece of land was owned by Native Americans, but this specific tribe is hazy. So some Native American tribes are more oral in their record keeping, and it's not clear who owned what piece of specific land. That is true. We have very spotted records. So sometimes it's very clear who owns it, and other times it's just hazy. So it's going to depend. Number three, the tribe in question may live and thrive elsewhere, such that return is too costly for them. Maybe if you're a former member of the Crow tribe or the Comanches or the Paiutes or the I have a little Apache in me on my dad's side. So maybe it would just be too costly. I'm part Native American. Should I return to my tribe? Well, no, because I live in Phoenix with my family, and that's not where I live isn't really the former land of the Apache, but I'm also not completely Apache either, so it's sort of beside the point. But I'm trying to use myself as just a silly example here, where just it may be too costly for them, so it may not matter that much. They may not want it back. Um, and then number four, the tribe in question stole land from another tribe, and so forth and so on. So in such cases, who is the so it's and so on. So it's not clear. So the tribe in question stole land from the tribe, and so forth and so on. It's not clear who the rightful owner is. Um, So Hendricks appreciates these are complications. So when the author just says, "Hey, let's just return the land," they're not saying just period or irregardless of lots of other complications. But there's another one they mentioned, which I think is nice. I think a lot of people, when they think about land reclamation, Native American issues, etc., whether it's in the United States or Canada, Australia with the Aborigines, any number of other groups, um, where they were here first, people will have this image in their mind, I think, of being displaced, having their belongings like destroyed, being homeless and just treated horribly. Ironically, because that's the way a lot of natives were treated. But as the author writes, this is not an isolated example. In the United States, Australia, and other countries, land claims are generally made first over lands owned by the government and usually occupied by very few people or none at all. At some level, we could attribute this to simple strategy, but as the author highlights, most natives understand the kind of trauma that being forced from one's home causes, and the difficulty of forcing some modern individuals to pay current costs for wrongs committed by the country as a collective. End quote. So what Hendricks is saying here is, yeah, I get it. You've got these images of your brain in your brain. People are worried when you say things like, giving land back to natives, that they're just going to be tossed from their homes without any compensation to fend for themselves, thrown to the wolves, no pun intended. And, because we've seen examples of what happens to other groups who have been displaced and thrown from their homes. It's not a pretty sight. Watching a bunch of people in covered wagons, like the Trail of Tears, for example, what's happening in the Middle East. Um, Watching a bunch of people move their only earthly possessions to someplace they've never been, ripped from their homes and the only place they've ever loved, is hard. It's a lot, and it's a heartbreaking prospect to inflict on anybody. So I don't know that this discussion really benefits from that nuance where people recognize that most Native Americans understand the kind of trauma that being forced from one's home causes, and the difficulty of forcing modern individuals to pay current costs for wrongs committed by the country as a collective. Meaning, I may be sitting on some land that used to be occupied by a tribe, and along with a lot of other people, and most natives understand that just throwing people off of that would be incredibly painful. And not only that, but it would make me pay for something that, I just moved to Phoenix a few years ago. I lived in California my whole life, in DC. So, granted, there could be tribes there too, but the point is that it's not a simple matter of natives used to own it, therefore get off. So there's the complications we listed in 1 through 4. And maybe the tribes don't exist anymore. The land was owned by Native Americans, but the specific tribe is hazy. Maybe it's too costly for the tribe to return, or maybe it's not clear who the land belonged to. But in addition to all that, displacing people from their land is painful. So I want these complications and nuances to be in the background as we continue with the discussion. So it's important to keep that in mind. That this isn't some land grab. It's more of an attempt to balance legal considerations and moral considerations with historical injustices and the value of the institution of property. Okay. So what about property claims that are weaker than we would like? So where the records are spotty or not quite as robust. Is there another reason for natives to pursue land claims? And the answer is yes, actually, to preserve minority culture. One thing that I've noticed when I travel, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, and if you ever get a chance to travel outside of the United States, or if you are outside of the United States, it's striking to the degree to which mainstream places you will travel internationally have become Americanized. And it's not everywhere, but the ubiquity of the Americanization of culture it's pretty striking. And you find it even in Native American tribes that are very culturally homogenous. You find it creeping into places like Amish and Amish villages and communities. Um, East, west, doesn't matter where you go, south, north. Um, So preserving minority culture in the face of that seems very, very valuable, especially valuable given how dominant American culture is. So what does our author say? Why does it matter? Well, a culture is often deeply valued by those within it because it provides a view of what matters in life and how it ought to be pursued. In other words, your culture gives you a worldview and it gives you a way of making sense of the world. And without that, it's not clear how you can make sense of it. So to be deprived of a culture that helps to provide meaning in one's life is not simply to be hampered in achieving some particular goal. It makes the entire project of living a coherent and meaningful life very difficult. Even if people are often able to overcome this loss, it is unfair to require that they do so without good reason. End quote. So our author recognizes culture isn't just about how you live, it's not just about existing, it's not just about how you identify, and it's not just about solving a particular problem. It's about how you make sense of the world entirely. Another way to put this would be culture is at least part of the answer for the question, why do you get out of bed in the morning? What purpose or meaning does your life fill? Why are you taking this college class? Why are you in school at all? Why are you living where you are? Why do you work where you work? Why do you eat the foods that you do and talk to the people that you do? These things are all influenced by culture. Culture provides at least partial answers to these questions. So without a culture, especially a minority culture, you're reliant on either other cultures or no cultures at all. It's a very alienating thing. And it's something that I think people who live in American culture who are, I mean, I'm one of them, at least, yeah, partly. If you're in American culture, you don't really notice it. Sort of like a fish may not notice that it's in water because it's so ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And it's the part of the background. It would be like you hear a background noise at first and then you stop hearing it because your brain tunes it out. So it's, I think, difficult to fully appreciate the value of a culture if you have one that's intact and very dominant. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that. But if you have a minority culture and it is on the risk of extinction, then you do. The entire project of living a coherent, meaningful life becomes very difficult for people in those cultures. So it's not just that property, the institution of property is valuable for things like solving tragedies of the but tragedies of the commons, but property claims can also help with culture and the value that culture provides. So there's also that. Um, and culture, and these points need conflict. So the moral disvalue of of displacing people is completely consistent with the value preserved minority cultures. In fact, as our author writes, if the possibility of ejecting current inhabitants makes us uneasy, and perhaps it should, these considerations remain relevant for the return of public lands, national forests, and so on which many sacred sites lie, sacred for Native Americans. Given the considerable quantities of public lands available in the United States, especially in the West, by the way, places like Colorado and Arizona, like there's huge swaths of land we just don't use. Such repatriation would be quite significant without threats to any individual landholdings. How these might be recognized in practice is a more difficult question that cannot be addressed here. So what the author, Hendricks, is saying is that we should balance the significance of minority culture, Native American culture, with the needs of current residents on the land previously owned by natives. It's worth noting that shoving people off of land they didn't directly steal, didn't have anything to do with, um, punishes them. And it punishes them in a similar way that punishing Native Americans for things that other Native Americans did would be unfair. My point is that even if the land is stolen, there's some nuance to it. It would be something similar to finding out that uh, the ambulance at the local hospital is just a repurposed van that was stolen from you. And the hospital didn't fully realize that it was stolen from you. But people rely on it to get emergency care, and there aren't a lot of other ambulances in the community. Do you reclaim the ambulance or not? You could rightly point out that you own the ambulance. It used to be a van. They turned it into an ambulance. Hey, you own the vehicle. That's true. You wouldn't be wrong about that. But by taking back the vehicle, you would be depriving people of emergency services, people who are not responsible for the theft. But the point is that there's some moral balance and nuance here. And I think the author does a nice job of highlighting that. The possibility of ejecting current inhabitants makes us uneasy, and perhaps it should. I agree. Perhaps it should. For the same reason that displacing Native Americans from their land should make us uneasy, even if we find out that they took it from a further tribe. Maybe the tribe's extinct, whatever. And it's not because you're necessarily entitled to, like, you're entitled to land that you stole. That's not how stealing works. That's not how property rights work. It's just acknowledging that property rights and historical injustices aren't the only things that matter. And maybe that you're displacing people from land that didn't do anything wrong per se, other than unwittingly buying land that was stolen a long, long time ago and not by them. It's complicated. So how might these be recognized in practice is a more difficult question that can't be addressed here, and we're not going to address here either, because this is just we're just touching on the issue. But there's another reason. Um, we really want, so preserving the memory of Native culture within the dominant culture of the United States has value too. So I remember one of the goals that giving back land might accomplish is that signaling to the dominant culture that there's value to the minority culture, Native American culture. Um, I think if you ask people, they would recognize the value there. They would get it. Um, so our author says, ideally, what we would want in such circumstances is a process of real reconciliation between the minority culture, Native American culture, and dominant culture, in which American national narratives become reformed in ways that allow natives to feel that they are tolerably safe and respected within the bounds of the United States. Such a process of reconciliation would not necessarily require all sides to adopt identical stories about who they are, but would at least require some meaningful recognition of where the differences lie, an understanding of why this is so, and a gentle tolerance of each other sides' differing opinion. End quote. So what Hendricks is saying here is that there's not just value in terms of property rights and incentivizing people to deal with tragedy of the commons. There's lots of value there, but it's not just that. It's also a way of preserving, giving back some land, um, especially at the margins where there's not a lot of inhabitants. Would also help to preserve the culture of Native Americans. But they would also do something else, which would help to restore the much more accurate view of Native Americans within the dominant culture. And if in the dominant culture, you're signaling that the Native American perspective doesn't matter that much, or that you can brush over injustices done to them, you're signaling that they don't matter that much. You're signaling a lack of dignity. Whereas if you return land, especially where it is easy to return and doesn't hurt anybody, um, large swaths for national parks, for example, just come to mind. Um, you can move towards a position where the dominant culture signals that natives do matter because their stories and what happened to them isn't swept under the rug. It isn't ignored. It's incorporated and acknowledged. And a very, very visible, costly, and hard to fake acknowledgement is giving back some land. So the dominant culture's understanding, respecting the history and the culture of minority culture can be a form of restitution. A future looking good for native tribes, peoples, and culture. So that's another value. That's the other valuable role or other goal that can be accomplished by returning land. So finally, just to wrap up, the last value. This ties in with last week and what we talked about, and with aspects of the Constitution. That granting Native Americans property rights would allow them another tool in their institutional toolkit to address tragedies of the commons. Overgrazing of land, for example, and overusing of groundwater would be huge issues for Native Americans. And as the political philosopher David Schmitz argues from our reading last week, the commons, for example, grazing land, fishing in a lake, is not a time capsule. It does not preserve the status quo. For all kinds of reasons, quality of life could drop after appropriation, meaning after someone acquires land for the first time, initial acquisition, quality of life in the piece of land could drop because they overuse it. However, pressures that drive waves of people to appropriate are a lot more likely to compromise quality of life when those waves wash over an unregulated commons. Meaning, if you have a lot of people and you introduce them to a piece of land, if you have property rights, resources are going to be preserved a lot better than if you don't. In an unregulated commons, those who conserve pay the costs, but do not get the benefits of conservation. So if you don't overfish, but others do, um, you pay by conserving. So you don't get the resources in the future from conservation because others have taken them. While overusers get the benefits but do not pay the costs of overuse. So if you're an overuser in a trade, like if you're shared lake and you overfish, you benefit from the lack of conservation. Whereas if I don't overfish the lake to preserve fish for the future, my conservation has a cost to it. I lose out on the fish and I don't get them in the future because other people took them. So at the end, the quote, therefore, an unregulated commons is a prescription for overuse, not for conservation. So this is another tool that Native Americans could use. Not that they have to, not that they will, not that this will even happen. but it's something worth thinking about. That the reason the founding fathers and the Constitution put in property rights, the reason economists insist that property rights are very valuable, is because we have this thing called the tragedy of the commons, and which ties in directly to prosperity and quality of life. And insofar as native peoples want their own land, this could be a good way get their land back. This could be a good way of ensuring that they're able, among with a lot of other tools, to manage the tragedy of the commons that will naturally ensue. But property rights and giving land back is just one way of trying to, and perhaps effectively, reconciling with Native Americans. So it's an interesting connection between our history and Native American peoples, the value of property rights, and the role of the Constitution and the law.